evening. My name is Mariam Majuka, and I serve as Executive Director of the Office of Civic and Community Engagement at Wake Forest University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the beginning of the Biden era panel discussion, which is the second event in our Defending Democracy series. Tonight, our panel discussion features two Wake Forest faculty members. Katy Harriger is a professor of politics and international affairs and faculty director of the Wake Washington program. And Betina Wilkinson is an associate professor of politics and international affairs and director of the Race, Inequality, and Policy Initiative, RIPI. This event is co-hosted by RIPI, the Office of the Provost, and Deeks Decide, a campus-wide election engagement project. The panel will be moderated by Chavis, Vice Provost, Professor of Law, and Director of the Criminal Justice Program of the Wake Forest University School of Law. We are streaming live on Facebook, and if you have a question for the panelists, please either utilize the Q&A box here or comment on Facebook. And now I will turn it over to our moderator.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you. This is the second installment in our series of Defending Democracy. Some of you may have tuned in to our first program, Guns, Democracy, and the Insurrectionist Idea, Unpacking Chaos at the Capitol. We spoke with Josh Horowitz about insurrectionism. And on March 16th, we have we will have the third in our series, March 16th at 6 p.m., Reimagining Democracy, Taking Civic Action. And there are a number of different groups and panelists from Equality North Carolina, Democracy North Carolina, and You Can Vote that will be a part of that. But tonight I am especially pleased to welcome Professors Betina Wilkinson and Professor Katy Harriger to talk with us about the beginning of the Biden era. We're all familiar by now of what happened on January 6th when, as our elected representatives were about to count the ballots and get ready for the Electoral College certification, when a number of insurrectionists, hundreds, perhaps thousands, we are still awaiting an investigation related to this, stormed the United States Capitol. And so my first question to our panelists is, what happened on January 6th? Was this a true coup, as it's been described by some folks, a coup attempt? Was it a protest? Was it civil disobedience? Katy.
I don't think it meets the requirements of a coup because in the political science literature, the notion of a coup is that you overthrow a government. And since the Trump administration was still essentially in effect, you couldn't really technically have a coup. I think it's certainly, for some people, the intent was insurrection, and it was certainly a riot in terms of the behavior that people engaged in. So I would say it was mostly a riot. My definition of civil disobedience is that it's peaceful, for one thing, and that people are trying to make a point, but not engaging in violence and attacks on others. And so I wouldn't consider it under my definition of civil disobedience.
And for me, I mean, was it a protest? I would say yes, it was a protest. They protested the fact that the presidential election was stolen from Republicans. Was it civil disobedience? I would say no, because, like Katy mentioned, it was violent and actually it resulted in the deaths of 5 individuals, with Capitol Riot Police not being able to control the protesters. Was it a coup attempt? I would say somewhat, so I officially looked up and was like, okay, how, do people wrap their brains around, a coup? What is it? And a coup by definition, just Merriam-Webster definition, is a sudden, violent, and illegal seizure of power from a government. So was it sudden? I would say somewhat. I mean, while numerous social media sites reveal that they were going to, prepare something, and that Republicans were going to storm the Capitol on this day, the day when the electoral votes were going to be certified, many were not convinced that this actually would happen, but it did happen. It happened suddenly. Was it violent? Yes, as insurrectionists stormed the Capitol, their entry was associated with chants of hanging Mike Pence, broken windows, destroyed furniture, shots fired, bullet holes throughout, and Capitol Police were not able to hold back the rioters from advancing. Was it an illegal seizure of power? So this is where, it becomes a little problematic. Somewhat, I mean, the rioters took control of the Capitol for 4 hours. So for 4 hours, Capitol Police were not able to control the rioters, and senators were hiding in the Senate chamber. So that's not cool, in the sense of whether they have, full control over their Capitol, somewhat, if senators were hiding in the Senate chamber, right? And throughout the Capitol building. Several legislators thought that they would die or severely injured in that day. And so, but complete seizure of power, that's left to be debated.
Thank you. So, another question, another thought, and I should also have mentioned that many of our questions tonight that I'll be asking have been generated by Deeks Decide, but viewers, and I know we have Facebook viewers as well as those streaming into the webinar, please send us your own questions. So another question is how, many Republicans have stated publicly that former President Donald Trump was responsible for inciting the violence that happened on January 6th, yet still voted to acquit him during the impeachment trial. What does this say about our Constitution? Do we have we're supposed to have checks and balances. Do these checks and balances still exist in our government today? Katy?
Well, I've asked myself that question a lot in recent years. and I do think that, and I teach a course on separation of powers, so I think about it a lot just in my work. I think that the separation of powers has eroded in significant ways as a result of partisanship, and especially the sort of hyper partisanship that we have right now. There's an article written by a political scientist and a law professor, Pildes and Levinson, that talks about the separation of parties rather than the separation of powers as being a better description of the way our system works nowadays. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I will say that I have been heartened by what seems like the continued sense of the courts, the federal courts, that their independence does allow them to provide a check. And if you look at the 60 some cases that attempted to challenge the election, not a one of them was successful. And some of the harshest criticism by judges of the arguments that were being made came from judges that were Republican. And so I feel like the judicial check is still working, but the congressional check is really largely dependent on whether a different party controls the White House than controls Congress. And when, the same party controls White House and the Senate, then I just think, impeachment, for example, clearly doesn't work. We saw that twice in the last year.
Yeah. Do you have thoughts on that, Dr. Wilkinson?
No, I agree. I agree with Katy when it comes to these sorts of things. We constantly question, well, not we, but, will the system that was established, hundreds of years ago still maintain and still apply today? And, we've yet to see what will happen, but yeah.
So does this mean, in some ways, because this is another thought that has been, we've seen commentators talking about authoritarianism. Are we slipping into authoritarianism? Are we comfortable with that, Dr. Harriger?
So in the comparative political science literature, we call it democratic backsliding. And democratic backsliding can lead to authoritarianism. And some of the sort of measures of democratic backsliding are things like lack of a willingness to think of the opposition as legitimate. For example, the whole concept of legitimate opposition is like an essential concept in democracy, right? That you have peaceful transitions of power, and that you accept, you fight it out in the election and then you accept the outcome and you move on. And so I worry, I would say that this election certainly suggests that we have a problem of democratic backsliding if we're not prepared to have a peaceful transition of power, and we're not prepared to accept the outcome, or like 40% of the country isn't prepared to accept the outcome of an election. That's problematic. If that party then proceeds to try to figure out how to keep people from voting in the next election, that's problematic. I mean, those are democratic backslidings that could lead us to authoritarianism. I don't think we're there yet, but they are warning signs.
And that you mentioned the democratic backsliding and this concept. We've seen just this week 43 states passing laws to restrict voting. We have the largest impact on restricting voting in the past 5 decades. So yeah. Any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on the recent the recent push, I guess, from some state legislatures to restrict voting and what that means?
Betina, do you want to?
I wasn't sure, Kim, if you were asking me or Katie. Well, I mean, one thing I'll say real quick I was thinking about your question to Katie, and I thought about how I'd respond. And one thing I want to emphasize is the fact that today, the amount of misinformation that exists throughout on social media and news media is just appalling, and it's unprecedented. And then that, along with the toxic polarization that we have in this country, really can set the stage for authoritarianism to thrive, whether it's from the left or from the right. And we've seen this in Latin America, we've seen this in Eastern Europe, we've seen this in African countries. And so we need to be very aware of that. I was actually, Kim, going to talk about the specific bills, HR 1, and then the 43 states who've actually drafted legislation later on. But I mean, I'll say in general that, this sheds light on how divisive we are as a country, how divided we are as a country. It feels like Democrats are living in, Republicans are living in 2 different worlds in terms of the values and beliefs that they have and what they want. So I don't know how, well, so I was going to answer that in terms of your question on Democrats and Republicans. Do you mind if we talk a little bit more about that, and so I can?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Was just going to ask about again. Yeah, do we think that? So we're in this polarized state. Do we think that Democrats and Republicans can find a common ground in light of what we've seen lately?
Yeah. So I would say, can they find a common ground? Hopefully. Will they find a common ground? Well, the future holds the answer to that question. So I'll take it from 2 different perspectives. One, if I put on my pessimist hat, I'll say that no, it'll be very difficult. At this moment, we have tribalism that hinders bipartisanship. Political parties are viewed in terms of good versus evil. Some Republicans have stated that they would rather be a Russian than a Democrat. Some Republicans believe that Democrats are their true enemies who are bringing down what makes this country great by allowing abortion, by allowing gays to get married, by allowing kids to choose their sex, by allowing unauthorized immigrants to smooch off of the government and take jobs from hardworking people, by allowing individuals to disrespect the police and do whatever they can to steal elections. According to the latest Quinnipiac University poll, 3 out of 4 Republicans believe that the 2020 presidential election was stolen, and believe that restrictive voting legislation needs to be passed to ensure that voter fraud diminishes. Thus, it is no surprise right now that we, as you mentioned, have 43 states that are drafting more than 200 bills to prevent voter fraud by imposing voter ID requirements, reducing mail-in voting, in-person early voting, and election day voting. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Democrats who believe that some Democrats who believe that Republicans are their enemy. Some believe that Republicans are racist, sexist, misogynistic, ignorant deplorables who will destroy our democracy, keep all Americans from voting, and do whatever they can to take us back to the 1950s. Earlier this month, we saw Democrats in the US House drafting H.R. 1, which is called the For the People Act, which pushes for an expansion of federal voting rights. Some of the key components of the bill include at least 15 days of early voting, mandatory online registration, restoration of voting rights for released felons, very distinct from the more than 200 bills that are being drafted by the 43 states, led by efforts led by Republicans. So we have yet to see what will happen, but it really doesn't seem like we will all come together, and find common ground. If I put on my optimist hat, I will say that actually there's room to consider the fact that not all Democrats believe that Republicans are the enemy, and not all Republicans believe that Democrats are the enemy, right? A recent example of this is the fact that a significant portion of Republicans who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 actually voted for Joe Biden in 2020. Throughout the country, and even in our state, North Carolina, the end of the Trump presidency was met with an uptick in the number of Republicans, registered Republicans, who left the party and either registered as Democrats or as unaffiliated. In North Carolina, for instance, more than 22,000 formerly registered Republicans voters switched to being Democrat, Libertarian, or unaffiliated, compared to around 5,300 during the same period 4 years ago. These Republicans were not impressed with Donald Trump and dissatisfied with the Republican Party. However, we also saw, though, some changes among Democrats as well. Not as much, but we did see some Democrats who were registered as Democrats for many years voting for Donald Trump in 2020, including Democrats who then also decided to leave the party, or because it wasn't too far to the left for them, or they just decided that it was, not Joe Biden was not the appropriate candidate. While the number of North Carolina Democrats who switched parties was not much smaller than North Carolina Republicans, as I mentioned before, it is important to recognize that switching did take place across the United States and throughout. So this sheds light on the fact that all constituents really are not happy with the direction that the political parties are heading, and therefore there can be room for bipartisanship. One thing I'll end with is just the fact that one topic that has brought people together is the Biden stimulus bill. So unlike what we saw recently this week, we know that according to a recent political survey, according to a recent Pew Research Center survey, the majority of Democrats, 89% of Democrats, supported the Biden stimulus bill, and more than half of Republicans, 60% specifically for the political survey, supported the Biden stimulus bill. However, 0 Republican legislators voted in favor of this bill. That is now law. So I'll end with that.
And that's an excellent segue to the next question I have for Professor Harriger, is that Biden ran on this unity message, but and this is perhaps the only chance to pass his agenda. And so how do we balance seeking that bipartisan support for initiatives, but actually delivering on the promises that he made to his constituents?
Yeah. Well, and so I think it seems like what he's doing is focusing on the promises that he made that are policy focused, as opposed to the promise he made about being bipartisan. And that's just a function of the reality of the way the Senate operates in particular, right? And the fact that, at least for right now, we still have a filibuster. And so I think the Biden administration has made the decision that they're not going to do what Obama did, which was to try to work in a bipartisan way on healthcare, for example, and then to, after all this effort and all these concessions that were made, still not get any Republican votes, right? And so a lot of the people in the Biden administration were formerly in the Obama administration, and they learned a lesson, which is get your policy agenda done, and especially when you have control of both houses. And so I think that's what you see happening, is that they just decided, and especially with this, as Betina said, as popular as the stimulus package is across party, there really wasn't anything for them to lose in that with voters, right, as opposed to, members of Congress. But I think it would be rich if Senate Republicans now suddenly wanted bipartisanship. I mean, they're the ones that took away the filibuster for Supreme Court justices, for example. They weren't willing to work that way. And, that it's just another example of, I think, this sort of escalating partisan battle. But I find it, what Betina said about Republican voters switching, the other thing that Trump had strong support from a group of voters who are lower income whites, whose his populist message appealed to them, right? They are people, especially in rural areas, who are actually really suffering in this economy and have been for a while, and he tapped into that. When I looked at some of the same data that she mentioned, they were overwhelmingly supportive of the stimulus package. Overwhelmingly, people in that group of voters. And I don't think their loyalty is to the Republican Party. Their loyalty was to Donald Trump. Right? And so if he's not in the picture, I don't see them, necessarily sticking with a Republican Party that doesn't want to support their economic interests.
And just recently, he said, don't give the money to the Republican Party, give the money to me, which says so much.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I had another thought, though, about if we're talking about President Biden, those first few days, we saw a lot of signatures on executive orders. So, and again, if we go back to 2016, we saw then President Trump signing a number of executive orders, undoing a lot of things from the Obama administration. So can either of you or both speak a little bit to this governing through executive order? Is this a new normal? Is it sustainable? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a function of two things. One is the just increasing power of the presidency in American politics, which has been a long-term trend, right? And the increased use of executive orders. But it's mostly a function of how dysfunctional the political system has become, right? I mean, it should always be preferable to get your goals, your policy goals done through legislation, right? And that's what our constitutional system imagines. And this, every 4 years or sometimes 8 years, doing and undoing through executive order is a sign of dysfunction. And I think that the fact that it happens across both parties is a function of the demand that constituents make for presidents to do something, and their frustration with not being able to get Congress to do it, right? And so they feel like they have to do it this way. I mean, I will say that I think Donald Trump maybe liked executive orders in particular because it felt like I can do this when I don't need Congress. But Joe Biden comes from Congress, that is his experience, and I think would prefer to have this stuff to happen through legislation. But the difficulty of getting that done and the sense of the need to pursue the policies in a particular direction, or in this case, to undo policies from the previous administration. Just it's like watching a tennis match every 4 years, right? But I think it's a sign of dysfunction.
Yes.
I was going to say, no, I agree. It's a sign of dysfunction. It's a sign of just how toxic, our political environment is, and it's sad. And so it's like, Joe Biden only has, some time for his honeymoon period to end. And so boom, 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 he's got to get things in, which is unfortunate the way that it has to be. But, we saw in the first few days just trying to undo some of the major executive actions that Trump did.
And Trump was undoing Obama executive orders, right? I mean, DACA is a perfect example of the limitations of governing by executive order, because it means DACA recipients are in the middle of that tennis match, right? Going back and forth. And whereas if you had a law passed by Congress, which again, there is public support for, and apparently even in Congress, bipartisan support for, but it can't get done, just tells you how messed up things are. That's a sophisticated political science term, messed up.
Well, this is, and here's a question that's come in, and something you alluded to, Katie, was the filibuster in the Senate. Do you think the filibuster in the Senate will go away within the next decade? Are we looking at an end to the filibuster?
I think so. It's already so significantly eroded, and each side, takes the next step. And, I think once it went away for judges, then you really have to, the way I think about the filibuster is, for me, it makes more sense to use it for judges because they have life tenure. And you should try to get candidates for judges that are, can appeal across party lines, and makes less sense to have it in a policy, for public policy where, the majority that wins an election should be able to pursue its policy agenda and then let the voters decide whether they like it or not. That's the way democracy should work. And so the only place it's left is in public policy. I think it's going to be further eroded, not within the next decade, but within the next year.
Wow. In the next year, we will see the Harriger prediction of the end of the filibuster. Betina, we have seen a lot of examples of politicians voting, casting votes that are out of line with public opinion on several key issues. One example, climate change. What does this mean for our democracy?
Yeah, no, that's correct. And, I just mentioned the fact that no Republican legislators, though we've seen a majority of Republican support for the Biden stimulus bill, no Republican legislators voted, in favor of the Biden stimulus bill. So I think that legislators in general should adopt the delegate model and represent the wishes of their constituents, because that is what they're put in office to do. However, honestly, that's in principle, but my answer is not that. My answer is multifaceted, because this is not a black and white issue. It's important to recognize several things. First, the lions of the Senate are gone. And so after John McCain died, Senator John McCain, individuals said that there are no more lions in the Senate. And I would agree. Particularly Republican legislators who will stand up for what they believe in is right, no matter the cost. Those are what I would deem as the lions of the Senate. Given the fact that only 7 GOP senators voted to impeach Trump last month, one of them, by the way, being North Carolina Senator Richard Burr, sheds light on the fact that only a few Republican senators will go against what many of their constituents want and will sacrifice their careers to maintain a democracy. Also, another reason as to why it's challenging for me to answer this question is because we have to recognize the importance that corporations place in legislators' behavior. So in 2010, we had Citizens United passed, and that means pretty much that corporations are individuals, and thus they play a much larger role in legislators' campaigns and their behavior in Washington. So because of this now, legislators, Republicans and Democrats, can act like puppets. I mean, they have for, you know, a long time, but now more, they probably feel more like puppets for their donors. And most recently, we've noted constituents' strong distrust and dislike of large corporations like Facebook and Amazon, but yet little to no legislation has been passed, you know, to push back the power and monopoly that Facebook, let's say, and Amazon have over their industry. And many would say that it's greatly because of the fact that Facebook and Amazon, you know, and Google are all, you know, giving lots of campaign contributions to Republicans and Democrats. But it's also one thing I want to emphasize, though, yes, corporations are playing a significant role in influencing legislators' behaviors, but we have seen the last few years, though, that Biden and Obama campaigns going out of their way to make the average person, the 99%, feel like they do have a stake in their democracy, with a motto that every dollar counts. And so we did see this push to collect, you know, $12 here, $20 there, to mobilize individuals to make them feel like their donation and vote matters. So in general, what does this mean for democracy? Well, without campaign financing reform and lions in the Senate, I would say our democracy suffers.
You know, the one thing I would just add to that is the fear of the primary and the challenge from the right or the left, from your right or your left flank, for, you know, your left flank if you're a Democrat and your right flank if you're a Republican. And that it's that fear that I think drives the lack of willingness to step across the aisle, because you're afraid you're going to be punished in the primary, right? In a general election, you might actually be rewarded for that kind of behavior, but if you don't get through the primary, and so the extremes on both sides, I think, are sort of keeping people from being willing to be bipartisan, because they think, well, next time the next election comes around, I'm gonna have a challenger, and they're gonna challenge me on not being a true Republican or a true Democrat, and I could lose my seat. You know, so I think that is an area that we really need to think about in terms of reform. I think both of the parties have to think about it if they want to survive.
Exactly. And thinking about, so we've talked a lot about polarization, you know, between you know, progressives and conservatives, liberals and conservatives. But I think each party is also dealing with two wings within each party. And so there's a question from our Facebook Live. It says, there seems to be a growing divide within the Democratic Party, with a growing progressive sector versus a more moderate conservative side. And so how do both of you envision President Biden striking the balance and building a more unified party, unified Democratic Party, and then push for more progressive policies?
Well, I think there's some evidence that he's attempted to do that, both in terms of his cabinet appointees. And so some of his cabinet appointees have very strong support from the further left, the more progressive part of the party, but he also has some sort of much more traditional ones. So I think he's done it through his cabinet appointees in particular right now. I mean, I think there will be some points where there are some battles, but right now there appears to be a recognition that, and maybe it's just the recognition from the past 4 years of how bad things could get if you don't work together, that makes them sort of set aside their, you know, pressure from the inside, but set aside their differences in terms of staying united, and also recognizing just how small their margin is if you want to get anything done. I mean, I think it was Obama who used to say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so, compromise is an essential aspect of politics. And one of the problems of the climate that we have in right now is people seem to think that compromise is a bad thing. And they worry that they're going to be punished for it, right, in the next election. But you can't make law without compromise, right? That's a requirement. And so I think they've got to. They'll have some battles. I think that, but right now they're trying to get as much done as they can while they have the majority.
Yeah.
In the hopes of keeping it and building it.
And I would add, I mean, there are policy issues that do bring Democrats together, whether they're on the far left, or more moderate. And so, I mean, we've seen that with, issues regarding COVID, with jobs, with even immigration and healthcare reform, things like that. So I would say that focusing on those specific issues that bring people together and getting a few bits of legislation enacted that actually help build confidence and momentum and support for him. But yes, he will definitely run into battles in the future, but at least the first few months are key.
And I want to go back to something that you said about the primary, and we've got a question coming in. It says, so how can we reform the system to diminish the negative impact of the primary on the ability of politicians to cross the aisle in bipartisanship? So what can we do to diminish the significance of the primary?
Katie, you go first.
Yeah, I mean, it's not simple. Because, I mean, there's some people who argue that you should essentially give the power back to the party and to party leadership to choose candidates, which is the way it was for a very long period of time. Certainly in presidential elections, primaries were not the major way in which somebody got the nomination until, the 1970s. Right? So I think if parties are going to be able to be parties in any traditional sense, they need to have more control over who can run under their label. And I understand that sounds undemocratic with a small d, but it's but you get some undemocratic outcomes by using a democratic device like primaries, right? So some kind of screening of candidates seems like the only really other alternative. But that would go against a sort of long-standing practice in American politics. It seems like you should have the people choose the nominees.
When it becomes complicated, because then, as Betina was talking about, you have Citizens United and all of the money that comes in.
Well, and the availability of money is also, it used to be, that was a way that the party could control who ran under their label, was who would they support with money, right? But now, if you can get some rich billionaire to bankroll you, you can run. You don't need the party to tell you, or if you can go and raise, huge amounts of money from small donors, which Trump also did successfully, right? And so the party's control of, who they were willing to help, they can still do that. They still do try to sort of cast support for somebody and, against other people, but it's too easy for independent candidates to just decide, entry is too easy, I guess is what I would say.
Do you think, we have another question from from Facebook Live and from the chat. Do you think populism will continue to impact our political culture going forward? Also, what conditions could be implemented to mitigate or reduce the influence of populism depending on its usage?
Well, one thing I'll say about populism is that populism and social media and the rise of social media can go hand in hand. And we have definitely seen a rise in populism because of people's increasing use of social media and people coming together and really pushing for things and congregating and developing, their policy ideas and views on a whole matter of things. Social media can do a lot of good, but at the same time, it can also misinform individuals and lie to individuals, and people wouldn't know any better. And so, populism, I think overall is not a bad thing, but we need to be aware of how, in general, it could bring about, let's say, if we don't like authoritarianism, it could eventually lead to authoritarianism, right? So that's important to recognize, right?
Mhm.
And so here's a substantive question about a particular law that we may or may not see passed in light of what happened at the Capitol. So one of our viewers wants to know, wants you to comment on the potential downside of creating more robust laws to tackle domestic terrorism. In light of the way that anti-terrorism policies have negatively affected some groups. So we know that we don't have a domestic terrorism statute. We have a international terrorism statute, but not a domestic terrorism statute. And do you think that there will be perhaps laws passed to deal with what happened at the Capitol? And then how do we balance that with how those laws might be used against other groups, minority groups?
Yeah, I mean, we already have laws in place that can deal with what happened at the Capitol. I'm not sure what new laws we need. I mean, there is a federal law that punishes, forbids your participation in insurrection and attempts to overthrow the government. So I don't think we need to name, I understand sort of where it's coming from in terms of people saying, well, if we have international terrorism, there's also domestic terrorism, we should call it that. But I think we have laws that already say you can't do these things, and that, people are currently being prosecuted under them, have been arrested and are going to be prosecuted under those statutes. So I guess I'm not one who thinks we need that more law is always the answer, especially if, sorry, law professor, but, especially if there's laws on the books that can deal with it. And I think that there are, is what I would say. And I do think that the worries about the way in which they might be used against Black Lives Matter protesters, for example, is a legitimate concern. There's been a lot of research that shows that hate speech and hate crime laws have been used more against African Americans than they have against white supremacists. So I think it's a legitimate concern, and I don't think we need it.
One thing I'll say about that, though, is the importance for people to recognize that in this country, we want individuals to be able to voice their, frustration or concern about the way that things are going. And freedom of speech is important. However, I would say that resulting in violent actions, is not the most appropriate way to do it. And we have a long history of civil disobedience. And so then the question is, there are certain ways to express your views in doing things.
Yeah, so in 2020, the 2020 election, younger people turned out to vote in historic numbers, yet they still lag behind older adults. So what do you think would help young adults, particularly our college students, turn out in larger numbers?
So college students do already turn out in larger numbers in that age group. I think that maybe more significant work that should be done is to emphasize young people who are not in college. That doesn't mean I don't think, mobilizing college students is important and helping them and providing them with ways to overcome the barriers of voting when they're away from home, for example, and I think our university has done a good job of helping students figure out how to vote, and including allowing them to use their residence in North Carolina to vote here. And so I think the university should do all of those things, that is, to make it. But the group that I worry the most about are young people who are not in college, whose interests are, much less likely to be represented in public policy. And how do we make their voices get heard, make sure their voices get heard so that they have some influence? And that's harder than it used to be, because it used to be that unions, for example, who were organizations that helped mobilize young people that weren't, blue collar workers who didn't have college degrees, right? But unions have been substantially weakened, let's put it that way, in our political system. And so the question is, what kinds of organizations can we have that help provide the support that college students get because their institutions provide that? What are the institutions for non-college young people?
And I'll echo a lot of the things that Katie said when it comes to, what can help students turn out, because Deek Society did a great job last year, and they have in the past in other election years, but especially last year. To be honest with y'all, I have to be shout out to Deek Society for really informing students, mobilizing students, transporting students to polling sites, things like that. That was really quite impressive, and that's exactly what needs to be done to mobilize, to get college students to turn out in larger numbers. One thing I'll say though is that the fact that there have been, we know this from survey data, and even just in conversations with students, sometimes college students don't feel like their views are represented by the people who are running for office. And, we've seen an increasing number of 18 to 29-year-olds identifying as independents. And so to me, the question is, why is that? What's going on? Is the two-party system not working out? In general, some latest Pew Research Center data reveals that the top issues for 18 to 29-year-olds are climate change, education, the economy, healthcare costs, terrorism, and jobs. And I think that Joe Biden did a better job than Donald Trump, when it comes to trying to appeal to the individuals when it comes to those issues. But still, there's still, I would say, a good bit of dissatisfaction among 18 to 29-year-olds when it comes to them feeling like the candidates who are running for office really represent their views always.
So I want to turn back to this question of the young voter and what we can do, and what specifically we may be able to do on the college campus. But before we close, I want to ask each of you to think about. So, what do you think at the end of 4 years? What do you think will have been Joe Biden's most significant either challenge or success? So you can pick one, either challenge or success for the Biden administration.
Well, I think it's very clear that the huge challenge that he came into was the coronavirus and its implications for citizens and their health, but also for the economy. And if he can, and I think that he believes that this stimulus package will help both get rid of the, get the virus under control, right? So there's a lot of money in it for increasing vaccines and for helping state and local governments provide the vaccines and all those sorts of things. So I think the rollout on that is really important, and getting it under control, and then having the economy rebound. And I think most important, this has been a really weird recession in the sense that a lot of people are not hurt at all, right? Have not been hurt at all financially. So I think I've heard it described as like a K recovery, where one part of the K is going up and the other part is going down. And so the question is, can he lift up those people who have been so decimated by this as well. And I think if he can do that, I think that that will be considered a great success. I mean, he came into a mess. There's that term again.
It fits.
Yeah, I agree. His big success is, and I think what will be, telling, of course, in the next few weeks and months, but the Biden stimulus bill, I think, will do a lot of good. And I mean, in general, we've seen the vaccine rollout, go into effect. And now, it seems like there's a really good chance that most of us will be vaccinated by June. And so in that sense, that's exciting, I think, for US residents, and to make them feel like, okay, I can get my life back in order and I feel comfortable doing what I was doing before. But one thing that I think, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball or anything, but, Biden, I think, will struggle with those on the far left when it comes to satisfying their policy concerns, issues, when it comes to issues regarding defunding the police, racial inequality, when it comes to even immigration and climate change. Of course, we still have 3.5 years left to go, and so we'll see what happens. But yeah, if he undid, of course, some of the executive actions that Trump did when it comes to immigration, but in terms of new legislation, in terms of new actions when it comes to helping promote and develop racial equality and inequity, we have yet to see what will happen with that.
And I would just add that in some ways the premise of that question also shows us what's wrong with American politics today. And that is that we get a new president, and then we think the president can do a lot more than the president can do, and unlike Donald Trump famously said, I have Article 2, which means I can do whatever I want. And that's not what Article 2 means. And in reality, in terms of lawmaking, the president is not the most powerful actor, right? He has got to persuade Congress or have enough people in Congress to do what he wants. And people get disappointed that a president doesn't accomplish something and then don't show up in off-year elections to help them have a Congress that could help them do something, right? Like, there's not enough understanding of the complexity of our system and what it takes to get things done, right? Which is back to the point about, government by executive order. Right. That's the big accomplishments are accomplishments of legislation, and whether he can accomplish those is going to depend on Congress.
So I want to kind of close out with this question. I know, and Katy, I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about the Wake Washington program and how you've seen students gain from that program. But what role do universities play in depolarizing our political landscape?
Well, they have political science departments.
And law
and law schools. Right. No, I mean, it is really important. There's a lot of ignorance about how our system works. I mean, that's been a theme, I think, of things I keep saying tonight. And part of it is the importance of people understanding why it works the way it does. Like, we have a very complex system of divided powers. And you need to understand that it's designed to work slowly and that it requires cooperation and bipartisanship, or you just get gridlock, right? I mean, that is a function of the design, right? And we've put way too much, so we can teach people about how the system works and how it's supposed to work and where it doesn't work. So part of it is just the education, and of course, understanding history is very important, and understanding how the media operates is very important. Media literacy; those are all things that we can teach, which is our primary function.
Yeah, and I would echo what Katy said. I mean, knowledge is really essential. And I would add, for students to be knowledgeable consumers of information along those lines, to be able to recognize strong arguments and not so strong arguments. We have, I teach research methods on a regular basis, and I tell them, this is one of the really important classes that you'll take, not because I teach it, but because you need to, understand what is a strong statement and the importance of having empirical evidence and behind the claims that individuals make, and recognizing what is good data and not so good data, and what is a strong argument and what is not that strong of an argument, and so on and so forth. And I would say, along the lines of what was mentioned before, the importance of exposing students that is a curriculum that includes classes on research methods, critical race theory, socialism, capitalism, numerous opportunities for them to learn about the world firsthand, with service learning opportunities, study abroad programs, the Wake Washington program, these experiential learning opportunities. Also, all those things help widen students' understanding of, who they are, how they think, how other people think, other people's experiences, that I think can develop a more depolarized world. But I do want to recognize that universities can only do so much. And this is, as we know, a time when many students can be more liberal, right, in their thinking than they would be later on in life. And so, some students may not change, but other ones will, because of their college experience, because of the classes that they've had, because of what they learned.
Well, fabulous. Thank you both for joining us for, again, our second installment of the Defending Democracy series, co-sponsored by the Office of Civic and Community Engagement and the Office of the Provost. And I'm going to turn it over to Mary Ann Majuka to close us out.
Thank you, Cami. Thank you so much to our panelists. This was just a wonderful opportunity to have so many of our questions answered. I appreciate your thoughtful responses. We have one more panel in the series next week on Tuesday, March 16th at 6 p.m. It is Reimagining Democracy, Taking Civic Action. And that panel is really focused on what each of us can do to reimagine our role in democracy, working with panelists from Equality NC, Democracy NC, and the You Can Vote project. So please join us next week for the final piece of this series. You can register on the OCCE website, and also this will be streamed on our Facebook page as well. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.